From my earliest memory as a child, one thing was always clear. My older brother was not long for this world. My brother Steve was born with a death sentence. He was born with a defect in his heart that stunted his growth, that limited his circulation. And my mother would tell me from time to time, your brother Steve has precious few days here on this earth. Steve is the oldest of 5 children. I'm the youngest. We were all born and raised in Los Angeles, California. My father wanted a strong son, but Steve would never be that person. He was just too small. He adopted the nickname Shorty, kind of an insult to himself in a way. He couldn't even run or walk quickly without being winded right away. But my mother, she molded him into a musician. And oh, what a musician he was. He was gifted, he was talented, he became a composer. He wrote his own music. He wrote jazz, classic, rock and roll. He even had a punk rock phase. He was highly influenced by the music of the 60s and the 70s. And he built an amazing repertoire that allowed him to express himself in so many different ways. Some of his music would be angry about his situation, about his knowing his own mortality, his own difficult physical circumstance. Some of his music was emotional, being unhappy about the fact that as a little guy, girls didn't always want to go on dates with him. Sometimes his music was topical. It was about the environmental movement of the 70s. There were different topics that moved him. But to me, he was amazing. He was my brother that I could sit next to on the piano bench and watch him practice his art. Watch him expand his repertoire, try out new styles, try out new ways of creating and notating his own music. But also he learned the classics. For his senior recital at the University of Southern California, he played the Moonlight Sonata from start to finish, memorized. And I sat there with him day after day and turned the pages of the music. I can even hear every single note of that today myself. But he would play that, and he would play so many other pieces. I would go to watch him at concerts. I was his biggest fan, and it was really just an inspiration for all of us in the household to watch my brother with his frail condition, with his weak voice. He could hardly even belt out the lyrics. You could hear him in the middle of a song getting exhausted just from singing on the stage. But he carried on. He soldiered on with his music. He really wanted to create something for the world. When I was 16 years old, I was in my high school track and field team, and I was out doing competitions, and for our final championship meet, my mother and father came to watch, and they brought my brother Steve. And I ran a 1-mile race, my best race in my life. And at the end of it, he told my mother, wouldn't that be amazing, just once, to run so fast and so long? And my mother told me that story that night. And it stuck with me. It put me in gave me a chance to see the world through his eyes. Not many months after that, he was getting more weak and more frail, and he had to move from his apartment back home. But we lived in a 2-story house, and it was too hard for him to go up and down the stairs to his old bedroom. So we set up a bedroom in the dining room. And that's where he slept. And one night, very sad night, I could see he was not in good shape. And I went to bed. And a few hours later, my other brother, Mark, shook me awake. Paul, wake up. Steve died. I was overcome with grief and with tears. But almost immediately, I had this other feeling inside. And I was uncomfortable with this. I didn't understand it because I felt relieved. After 17 years of living, knowing every day this could happen, it had happened. It was over. There was no more to worry about. There was nothing left to be uncomfortable with. There was nothing left to anticipate. This came with a finality that was so profound. And yet there I was, lying in my bed, hearing this news, waking up, and having these conflicting feelings in my heart. The next week I was a zombie, walking through and just going through the motions that happens when a loved one passes away. You go to a funeral, you go to a burial, you go to a memorial service, family comes over, friends come over, neighbors come over, they bring food. And the whole time I simply sat, conflicted, my eyes dried out from crying over and over, and then I had nothing left. There was nothing more. It was done. After so many days and days and days, I was embarrassed inside to admit to myself that I simply wanted to get on with the rest of my life without Steve. But this hit my mother the hardest, obviously. For mothers and fathers worry every single day of every single year when their children are living and worry about these things. And for my mother, it was a crushing blow. Steve was the embodiment of her hopes and dreams. And when he died, a part of her died too. But what Steve did is, for us, without even realizing it, he did us all a favor in the family as we sat and would reflect and hold on to his memory. He had written down everything he had composed by hand. A stack this thick of sheet music, of all of his creative genius, documented. And of course there were boxes and boxes of audio tapes, recordings from studios and recordings from live concerts. He gave us this incredible gift that we could use to hold on to him, to carry him forward. And my mother, she tried her best in her own ways to keep the music alive and to keep his memory alive. And my other brother, Mark, he even regrouped with the old bandmates, and they did a tour and played at some small clubs around California and the West Coast and brought that punk rock music back to life. It was so fun. But for my mother, it was incomplete. Many years later, and many years after my father had passed, my mother had a boyfriend. And when he died, she inherited a small sum of money. And she immediately set to work on a project. She brought my brother on board, my brother Mark, and the two of them planned a concert. A concert to take one of Steve's works, to revive one of his most complex pieces, a 17-minute piece called the Ecology Suite. It's more a classical performance than it is rock and roll, but it really represents his creative genius at its finest. And they hired a 10-piece orchestra, and they had the entire song re-scripted and re-orchestrated for this 10-piece group. And they recorded it in the studio, and then they performed it one night live at a small venue in Los Angeles, and I was there for that. And that performance was captured by a professional video crew. So that piece of music, up on YouTube right now, has had nearly 20,000 views, and is in its own special way, it just captures, if you will, that moment, that my mother was able to do something so powerful, so strong. It was her magnum opus. This was her greatest performance, to bring my brother Steve back to life. Because in this live performance, you can watch it yourself on YouTube, near the end, when it's in the final portion, the third movement, if you will, and it gets to the second verse, and the band is performing, and the singer has been singing the first verse, and the conductor is conducting, and you see him point to the sky. And out of the sky comes my brother Steve's voice, recorded 40 years before, in one of his last recordings he made when he was living, of him singing those last two verses. And they blended in live with the orchestra. Live performance where this one final time he had his encore as well. Not long after that show, my mother passed away. In my view, she had accomplished her life's purpose. There was nothing much more to do. As for me, I'm still conflicted of those mixed feelings that I had then and even now. But I am proud of what my mother and my other brother Mark, and of course my brother Steve, created and left as a gift for the world. Or at least for as long as we have YouTube. Thanks.